I had spent years saving up to buy my dream home, only to find out that the HOA, led by none other than the power-hungry Karen, had blacklisted me from purchasing any property in the neighborhood. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a personal attack. My offer had been solid, my credit flawless, yet somehow, every house I bid on mysteriously slipped through my fingers. Curious, I dug deeper, reaching out to a few realtors I knew. What I found made my blood boil. Karen had been spreading rumors, warning homeowners and realtors not to sell to me, claiming I was the wrong kind of buyer. What that meant, I had no idea. But I knew one thing. Karen had underestimated me. Instead of fighting her directly, I played the long game. What she didn't know was that I had resources far beyond what she imagined. She thought I was just another hopeful homeowner, desperate to fit into her perfectly controlled neighborhood. But I had spent years quietly investing in properties, and I was no stranger to real estate deals. If she wanted to play dirty, I would beat her at her own game. While Karen paraded around her little HOA kingdom, enforcing ridiculous rules and turning away buyers she deemed unworthy, I worked in silence. Through a network of business partners and anonymous LLCs, I started purchasing properties just outside the neighborhood's boundaries, empty lots, foreclosed homes, and commercial spaces. Slowly, I built my empire, one deed at a time, all while Karen continued believing she had me under control. Then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. A large chunk of properties went up for sale in an adjacent city block, one that had been neglected due to Karen's refusal to allow outsiders in. The former owners, tired of her interference and impossible rules, were eager to sell. The moment I saw the listing, I moved fast. Within weeks, I had acquired multiple properties, effectively controlling an entire city block just outside Karen's precious HOA territory. The irony? Karen had spent years trying to keep me out, only for me to end up owning the very land that would determine her neighborhood's future. The first sign of trouble for Karen came when she noticed the sudden activity near her border. Renovations, construction crews, and fresh landscaping. She stood on her pristine, perfectly regulated sidewalk, watching with suspicion as workers unloaded materials and surveyors marked property lines. She tried to make phone calls, reaching out to local officials and realtors, desperate to know what was happening. But the information she received was vague. Someone was developing the land, but the buyer remained a mystery. That's when Karen made her first mistake. She assumed it was some corporate developer, an outsider with no understanding of her power. She had no idea it was me. I let her stew in her paranoia for weeks, watching as she grew more agitated. She even called an emergency HOA meeting, warning residents that an unknown buyer was threatening their community's stability. She encouraged them to prepare for a fight, telling them they needed to be ready to challenge whatever was coming. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet takeover. With my property secured, I started working on Phase 2, expanding services that Karen's neighborhood desperately needed. I bought the only available commercial spaces in the area, ensuring that any new businesses, from grocery stores to coffee shops, would be under my ownership. If Karen's residents wanted anything, they would have to go through me. The day finally came when Karen could no longer ignore reality. She arrived at the city planning office, demanding to know who had acquired the properties surrounding her neighborhood. That's when she saw it, my name, clear as day, listed as the owner of the entire city block. I wish I could have seen her face in that moment, the realization crashing down on her. She had spent so much effort keeping me out, only to find herself completely surrounded by my influence. She stormed out of the office, furious, her mind scrambling for a way to undo what had already been set in motion. But it was too late. The neighborhood she had ruled with an iron fist was about to experience a shift in power, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Karen stormed back into her neighborhood like a queen returning to her castle under siege, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to feeling out of control. And now, the very land she had fought so hard to keep pure was in the hands of the one person she had worked tirelessly to shut out. The residents, noticing her sour mood, whispered among themselves. The HOA board members looked uneasy, sensing that their leader was rattled. Karen called an emergency board meeting that evening, gathering her most loyal supporters in the community clubhouse. She slammed a folder onto the table, filled with copies of property records, records that all had my name on them. The room fell silent as realization sank in. Their pristine little bubble was no longer untouchable. Karen refused to accept it. She barked orders, demanding they find legal loopholes, file complaints, anything to stop me from making changes. She even proposed ridiculous HOA rules, hoping to extend their power beyond their official boundaries. But reality was a cruel thing. I didn't own a single home inside their HOA, meaning their rules held no weight over me. The control Karen had enjoyed for years stopped exactly where her borders ended, and unfortunately for her, the rest of the world didn't follow her playbook. Still, she wasn't going down without a fight. That's when she made her second mistake. She tried to sabotage my properties. The first signs were small. My workers reported anonymous complaints filed against them for violating neighborhood aesthetics. Inspectors suddenly started showing up, nitpicking irrelevant details, clearly sent by someone with influence. The grocery store I was planning to open suddenly faced zoning issues that hadn't existed before. It was Karen, pulling every string she could to slow me down. What she didn't know was that I had already anticipated her every move. I had seen her use these tactics before against homeowners she didn't like, using red tape and bureaucracy to make their lives miserable until they packed up and left. But I wasn't a frustrated homeowner. I wasn't a family just trying to make ends meet. I was someone who had played this game at a level she couldn't even comprehend. While Karen played her petty games, I played the long one. Instead of reacting to her tricks, I focused on pushing forward. I hired top legal experts who swatted away the complaints like flies. I met with city officials, ensuring that my projects weren't just legal but beneficial for the community. And most importantly, I began winning over the very people Karen had ruled for so long. I hosted open meetings, inviting homeowners from her HOA to discuss what they actually wanted in their neighborhood. For the first time, they realized they had a choice. They weren't trapped under Karen's rule. The grocery store she tried to block? It became a fully stocked, resident-supported market, while her HOA still debated paint shades. The new park she tried to stall? It became a reality, filled with families who had never even been consulted in her so-called community decisions. One by one, the cracks in her kingdom began to show. The final blow came when local businesses, tired of Karen's suffocating regulations, started relocating just outside her HOA's borders, to my properties. Her tight grip on neighborhood commerce shattered as residents realized they could get better services without paying Karen's ridiculous HOA fees. For the first time, her influence had a limit, and the people were starting to see what life was like without her. Karen, desperate and cornered, called yet another emergency meeting, but this time, fewer people showed up. The ones who did came not to rally behind her, but to question her. Why were they paying HOA dues for problems that never got solved? Why were they fighting against businesses that actually helped them? Why was Karen's pride more important than their community's growth? She had ruled them with fear for so long that she never considered what would happen when they stopped being afraid. And now, that moment had arrived. Karen sat at the head of the HOA meeting, her fingers gripping the edges of her clipboard as she tried to maintain control. But the faces staring back at her weren't filled with admiration or obedience like they used to be. They were filled with doubt, with frustration, with something Karen had never seen before, resistance. She tried to keep her voice steady, listing out complaints against my developments, spinning tales of disaster, warning them that if they didn't act now, their once perfect neighborhood would be swallowed up by outsiders. But the problem was, the people she was talking to weren't blind anymore. They had seen the changes just beyond their HOA's borders, the improvements, the new businesses, the freedom to live without someone measuring their grass height or dictating what color their door had to be. Some of them had even shopped at my stores, enjoyed my new parks, and realized that the world outside Karen's iron grip wasn't the chaotic wasteland she had spent years warning them about. It was better. Her words didn't hit the same way they used to. The whispers started small but grew louder. People were murmuring about how much their HOA fees had increased, yet nothing ever seemed to improve. Someone finally spoke up, questioning where all the money was going. Karen bristled, her usual confidence flickering, as she waved a dismissive hand and called for order. But order was slipping. Another homeowner pointed out that the city had approved new road repairs outside the HOA, while the streets inside still had cracks from last winter. Another neighbor asked why Karen was so focused on stopping me when she had spent years ignoring real issues, like failing drainage and streetlights that hadn't been fixed in months. The room, once her kingdom, was turning against her. Karen, desperate to regain control, did something that sealed her fate. She announced that the HOA board had voted to increase fees again, blaming it on the need to protect property values from the developments happening just beyond their borders. But that was the final straw. The tension snapped. Someone stood up and shouted that they were already paying too much for rules that didn't benefit them. Another demanded to see the HOA's financial records. A couple near the back muttered something about how they had just visited my new commercial center and found it better and cheaper than anything inside the HOA. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted into arguments, not against me, but against her. Karen tried to control the chaos, but the moment had already passed. She had lost them. They were no longer afraid. And once people stop being afraid, they start asking the questions they should have asked long ago. Where was all the money going? Why were they being told to fear something that was clearly improving their quality of life? What, exactly, did Karen actually do for them? The doubt she had worked so hard to suppress had turned into full-blown rebellion. Homeowners started discussing ways to challenge the HOA's power, to vote out the board, to take back control of their own community. Karen, who had spent years ruling without question, finally felt what it was like to have no control at all. Outside that meeting, I continued to watch everything unfold. I didn't need to be in that room to know what was happening. Change was coming, whether Karen liked it or not. My businesses were thriving. The families in my properties were happier than ever. The city saw my development as a positive force, approving more projects that would slowly reshape the entire landscape of the area. And Karen, once untouchable, was now scrambling just to hold on. But the thing about people like her, they never go down quietly. And I had a feeling she still had one desperate move left to play. Karen was not the kind of person who accepted defeat. Losing control of the HOA board meeting had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had made her more desperate. The very people who had once hung onto her every word were now questioning her, some even turning against her. But Karen had spent too many years bending the system to her will, and she wasn't about to let everything slip away just because a few residents had started thinking for themselves. No, she still had tricks up her sleeve. If she couldn't rule with fear, she would rule with chaos. And that's exactly what she unleashed. The next morning, a wave of sudden violations hit the neighborhood. Homeowners who had never been fined before woke up to notices on their doors, warnings for mailbox heights, driveway stains, unapproved garden decorations. Even the residents who had never had a problem with Karen's leadership suddenly found themselves drowning in fines. She was tightening her grip, hoping to make life so frustrating that people would give up and rally behind her just to restore order. But she had miscalculated. Instead of panicking, the residents started talking. They compared fines, realized they weren't alone, and pieced together what Karen was doing. The woman who had always controlled them through whispers and quiet threats had made the mistake of pushing them too hard, too fast. Instead of restoring her rule, she had ignited something else, rebellion. But Karen wasn't done. When scare tactics failed, she moved to sabotage. City officials, some of whom had been in her pocket for years, suddenly started showing up at my properties, questioning permits and inspections that had already been approved. Delays started appearing out of nowhere, construction crews receiving last-minute roadblocks that hadn't been there before. Trash collection for my properties mysteriously stopped, mail service lost, important documents, and businesses faced surprise inspections that conveniently lined up with their busiest hours. Karen was throwing everything she had at me, convinced that if she could create enough chaos, I would cut my losses and walk away. But what she failed to understand was that I had spent years preparing for opponents like her. While she was busy pulling strings, I was cutting them. I had built relationships not just with the city, but with people who mattered. Business owners, council members, the very inspectors she thought she could weaponize. So when Karen tried to make my projects grind to a halt, she was met with resistance of her own. Officials started questioning why one neighborhood was receiving so many sudden complaints when no actual laws were being broken. Investigations were launched, not into me, but into her. Her years of pushing people around, of using the system to punish those who didn't obey, had left a paper trail. And when people started digging into the HOA's finances, they found exactly what I had expected: misuse of funds, unexplained expenses, personal payments that had nothing to do with community upkeep. Karen had spent years hiding behind rules, pretending to uphold property values. But in the end, the truth was simpler than that. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was milking it. The whispers that had started in that last HOA meeting had grown into something much bigger. People who had once been her strongest allies now questioned why their money had been wasted while their streets crumbled. Homeowners who had once feared her now demanded to know where their thousands of dollars in fees had gone. And then, the biggest blow came. A formal request for a full audit of the HOA's finances, signed by more than half the community. Karen had spent years enforcing rules to keep people under her control. Now, those same rules were turning against her. But the moment I knew she was truly finished, the day the city council announced that they were officially reviewing the HOA's influence over the area, reconsidering whether Karen's beloved neighborhood should even remain under HOA control at all. Karen had built her power on the belief that people had no choice but to follow her, that they needed her, that she was untouchable. But now, for the first time, she was the one being cornered. And I could already see it, her mind racing, her desperation growing. She wasn't going to let go willingly. No, she was going to fight until the very last moment. But the thing about desperate people? They make mistakes. And Karen was about to make the biggest one of her life. Karen was running out of options, and she knew it. The walls were closing in, the very neighborhood she had controlled for years turning against her. But she wasn't the type to step down gracefully. She had spent too long building her power, too long shaping the HOA into her personal kingdom, to watch it crumble without a fight. And so, in a final act of desperation, she did something reckless. She tried to take the fight directly to me. It started with a lawsuit. A flimsy, last-minute attempt to block my developments under the claim that they were damaging the character of the neighborhood. The argument was weak, the legal standing non-existent, but that wasn't the point. Karen wasn't trying to win in court. She was trying to buy time, to create more obstacles, to make my life just difficult enough that I might reconsider my investment. What she didn't anticipate was that I was 10 steps ahead. The lawsuit was dismissed before it even reached trial, tossed out by a judge who saw right through her tactics. But Karen wasn't done. Days later, an anonymous petition started circulating, demanding that my businesses be restricted from operating near the neighborhood. The signatures were suspiciously similar, many belonging to homeowners who later admitted they had been pressured to sign under the threat of HOA fines. But the damage was done. The petition made headlines, stirring up a public debate about preserving neighborhood integrity. Karen took full advantage, playing the victim in carefully crafted statements, painting me as an outsider trying to destroy the community she had worked so hard to protect. But she had underestimated how much things had changed. The residents who had once feared her were no longer listening. The businesses she tried to target were thriving. The city officials she had once controlled had begun to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with an HOA now under official financial investigation. Karen had spent years believing that the neighborhood was hers to rule, that no one would ever dare stand against her. Now, she was watching her influence collapse in real time. And then came the final blow, the results of the HOA audit. When the financial records were finally revealed, they told a story Karen couldn't spin her way out of. Thousands of dollars in unexplained expenses, community fees that had somehow found their way into her personal accounts, lavish business trips that had no paper trail. It was fraud, plain and simple, and the moment the news broke, everything she had built came crashing down. The same residents who had once feared her now demanded her removal. Her supporters abandoned her, realizing that defending her meant being complicit. The HOA board, desperate to salvage what was left, had no choice but to vote her out entirely. And just like that, the reign of Karen was over. She didn't take it well. There were reports of her ranting outside City Hall, threatening lawsuits, blaming everyone but herself. But it didn't matter anymore. Her power was gone. The neighborhood she had ruled with an iron fist had slipped through her fingers. And as she packed up her things and prepared to leave the community she had once controlled, I couldn't help but wonder if she finally understood the truth. She had never really owned this neighborhood. She had only borrowed it. And once the people saw they had a choice, they chose to be free of her. The final weeks were quiet. The HOA, under new leadership, underwent drastic changes, lower fees, clearer rules, actual transparency. The businesses Karen had tried to stop flourished, becoming an integral part of the community. And as for me, I didn't have to do anything. The neighborhood had changed on its own, simply by realizing it didn't need Karen's control to thrive. The day she finally left, driving past my properties with one last bitter glare, I knew she had learned a lesson she would never forget. Sometimes, the very people you try to control are the ones who end up taking everything from you. And in the end, Karen had blacklisted me from buying one house. But I had ended up owning the entire city block. And now, it was mine to shape, not through fear, not through force, but by giving people something Karen never had. A choice. Karen's departure wasn't the grand spectacle she had imagined for herself. There were no desperate pleas from homeowners begging her to stay, no HOA board members scrambling to defend her, no officials willing to lend her one last favor. Instead, it was silent. The same residents who once feared her barely acknowledged her as she loaded the last of her overpriced furniture into a moving truck. The neighborhood had already moved on. The HOA, under new leadership, was working to undo years of excessive fees and pointless rules. My businesses continued expanding, attracting not just the homeowners Karen had once controlled, but people from surrounding areas who saw my properties as the new heart of the community. Karen had spent so much time trying to keep me out, never realizing that in doing so, she had driven the very people she controlled straight to me. The ripple effect of her downfall spread far beyond just the HOA. The city council, now fully aware of her financial manipulations, began a deeper investigation into how Karen had managed to operate unchecked for so long. The same officials she had once counted on to back her every decision suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. Even the realtors she had pressured into blacklisting me from buying in her neighborhood began reaching out, offering deals on properties she had once deemed off limits. But by then, I didn't need them. I had already built something bigger, something Karen could never control. What she failed to understand until the very end was that power isn't about forcing people to follow you. It's about making them want to. Karen had ruled through fear, through intimidation, through the illusion that she was the only thing keeping the neighborhood valuable. But once people saw the truth, they had no reason to stand by her. In contrast, my approach had been the opposite. I didn't force people to come to my properties, to shop at my businesses, to support my developments. I simply created something better and let them decide for themselves. And when given the choice, they chose freedom. The final weeks after Karen's departure solidified everything. With her gone, the last of her influence crumbled. The businesses she had fought to keep out became community favorites. The HOA board, now focused on real improvements instead of petty fines, actually started listening to homeowners. People who had once followed Karen's rules without question began openly questioning why they had ever tolerated them in the first place. The more they talked, the more they realized how much they had lost under her rule, not just in money, but in the simple joys of homeownership. Now, they were free to paint their doors whatever color they wanted, to decorate their lawns without fear of violation notices, to actually enjoy living in a place that once felt like a prison. And me? I watched it all unfold with satisfaction, knowing that I had done exactly what I set out to do, not just to beat Karen, but to outlast her. She had tried to shut me out, and in doing so, she had given me the leverage to take everything from her. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about reshaping an entire community into something better, something stronger, something Karen had never been capable of building. And as I looked out over the thriving neighborhood, the bustling businesses, the homeowners finally living without fear, I knew that while Karen had spent years believing she ruled this place, the truth was, she had only been a temporary chapter. The real story had just begun. Karen's house sat empty for weeks, a hollow reminder of the control she once wielded. The blinds were drawn tight, the once pristine lawn now slightly overgrown, a quiet symbol of how quickly she had faded from relevance. No one asked where she had gone. No one cared. The same neighbors who once followed her rules without question now gathered in front yards, talking and laughing without fear of violating some ridiculous noise ordinance. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalks where Karen once patrolled with her measuring tape. It was as if the neighborhood had woken up from a long, exhausting nightmare and realized they had been the ones keeping themselves trapped all along. Her downfall had sent shockwaves through the entire HOA system, exposing years of corruption that had long been buried under legal jargon and excessive fees. The new board, desperate to regain trust, was forced to make major changes. Fees were slashed, absurd restrictions removed, and, for the first time in decades, residents were actually given a voice in how their own neighborhood was run. The shift was undeniable. Homeowners who once kept their heads down started questioning things. They pushed back against policies they had blindly accepted for years. The entire foundation Karen had built her power on, fear and compliance, was crumbling, and there was nothing left to hold it together. Meanwhile, my properties flourished. The businesses Karen had fought so hard to keep out became staples of the community. The grocery store she had tried to block was now the busiest spot in town, its parking lot full at all hours. The coffee shop I had opened became a gathering place, a hub of real connection in a neighborhood that had once been eerily silent. The park, which she had claimed would ruin the aesthetic, was filled with families, its benches occupied by neighbors who had never spoken to each other before. What Karen had feared most had come true. People had stopped needing her. But while the neighborhood moved on, I knew Karen wasn't the type to disappear completely. She had spent too long seeing herself as irreplaceable. Losing her title, her influence, her entire identity as the HOA queen. There was no way she would accept it quietly. I expected some sort of last-ditch effort, some desperate attempt to reclaim what she had lost. And sure enough, it came. A whisper at first, then a rumor, then a full-blown announcement. Karen was filing a lawsuit against the new HOA board. Her argument was as predictable as it was pathetic. She claimed that the changes being made were illegal, that she had been unfairly removed, that the homeowners had been manipulated into rejecting her leadership. It was a desperate move from someone who refused to admit that she had been the problem all along. But what Karen failed to realize was that the same people she had ruled over for years had finally seen through her. Her threats didn't scare them anymore. If anything, they infuriated them. The homeowners who once whispered their complaints in private were now openly calling for her to be banned from ever being involved in HOA leadership again. The same residents who once tiptoed around her now laughed at her pathetic attempt to regain control. She had no power here anymore. The lawsuit barely lasted a month before being thrown out. The judge saw it for what it was, a weak attempt at clinging to a throne that no longer existed. And with that, the last remnants of Karen's reign were erased. She had spent years dictating every detail of people's lives, convinced that she was the foundation of the neighborhood's success. But in the end, all it had taken was a shift in perspective for people to realize they had been better off without her all along. The final confirmation of her irrelevance came in the simplest of ways. A new family moved into her old house, a young couple with 2 kids and a dog, the kind of homeowners Karen would have nitpicked to death over minor infractions. They repainted the door a bold shade of blue, something Karen would have fined them for instantly. But this time, no one cared. No one reported them. No one left angry letters in their mailbox. Instead, the neighbors welcomed them, offering baked goods and invitations to backyard barbecues. The house that had once symbolized strict rules and control was now just another home, blending into the community that had finally learned how to breathe again. As I stood in my office, overlooking the thriving city block that Karen had once tried to keep me out of, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. She had fought so hard to stop me, believing that my presence would ruin everything she had built. But in the end, I hadn't needed to destroy her. She had done that all by herself. All it had taken was a little patience, a little pressure, and the realization that when given the choice, people will always choose freedom over fear. Karen had blacklisted me from buying one home. And in return, I had taken everything from her, not by force, not by deception, but by simply offering people something better. The last I heard of her, she had moved to another city, trying to worm her way into a new HOA board, desperate to regain the control she had lost. But it wouldn't be the same. She would never have the same hold over people again because now she knew what it felt like to be powerless. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Not just for me, but for everyone she had once controlled. She had spent years believing she owned this neighborhood. But the truth was, she had only been borrowing it. And the people had finally taken it back.